Hi friends, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I thought we could do kind of a chatty video going over all of the things that I DNF'd last year and try to find sort of a common thread. So I have my lunch, which is oatmeal because we're mature adults, and my third coffee of the day. Go through all the books on my DNF won't return to list. So I have two lists on my Goodreads, which if you haven't followed me on Goodreads, you really should. Shameless plug. I keep up with it pretty regularly, so if you want to know what I'm reading in the moment, you can check that out. I have two folders. A DNF will return to, which I just wasn't feeling in the moment, or maybe my library loan ran out, or what have you. So it's books that I want to give a second shot at another time. And then obviously the DNF won't return to is a fairly obvious thing. So we are going to go through the books that I DNF'd last year. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're just gonna see if we can see some common threads. So this is obviously gonna be all over the place because DNFs don't count as read, so they get sorted by the date they were added. But if I added it like 6 years ago, then it's not going to show up. It's just not going to show up in like a good order to when I actually DNF them. So we will go to my first DNF according to this of the year was Not Priest. I actually DNF'd this pretty recently. And so I DNF Priest for a pretty common reason, pretty common issue that I have with a lot of romances. It was like all about sex, and I find that the more I read romance, the less I like sex-centered stories. And the hero was annoying. He was very like, I'm a feminist, but I'm a dominant, but also I'm a feminist. Don't forget I'm a feminist, but I like to dominate women, but I'm a feminist. Weird. The heroine just felt really shady and just didn't respect his boundaries, I didn't feel like, and she was just creepy overall. I would read more from this author, but like I said, more sex-centered stories just aren't really my thing anymore. So then we have Things I Wanted to Say But Never Did. Again, I DNF'd this closer towards the end of the year, but this is a really, really long book. I'm nothing if not a lover of bully romance, but I don't like really long bully romances because stereotypical bully romance tropes don't work in repetition. So if it's fun and short and steamy and over the top and dramatic, that's great, but if it's overly long, it's too much. So that's kind of the situation there. I didn't really feel like much was going on. It was set in a school, and it just the page count just didn't make sense to me. So then we have I'll Be Gone in the Dark. That's like a true crime. I'm not going to get into that. It's not really relevant. We have Cruel Kings, which I read for the Taboo Book Club hosted by Tamika at Tamika's Library. This is a step sibling, I think. It was a whole entire mess. It was like assault after assault after assault after assault after assault, and the writing was absolutely horrendous. So all right, so we have The Ritual, which is a horror novel. We have Blockshot by Kennedy Ryan. I love Kennedy Ryan. One of my all-time favorite romance authors, but this one, I hated the way that the cheating was handled, and there was an addition of an incurable illness in this that was used to like keep the couple apart, and I just didn't like the way any of it was handled. I didn't like the hero's lack of respect for other people, so I was not a fan. We have Big Little Lies, Night Bitch, and The Push. I don't like mother-centered stories or kid-centered stories, which Night Bitch and The Push are, and then Big Little Lies. I have been considering coming back to this, but I loved the TV show, and the tonal differences between the two just kind of got to me. But it's a massive book, but I've considered going back to it. So it might get added to the will return to shelf, but there's really nothing to gain from like evaluating why I DNF'd that. So next up we have Praise. One of the saddest DNFs of the year. I didn't put it in my disappointments because I never finished it. Something that I don't like is when conflict, like internal conflict, is used as a point of conflict in the relationship in the way that it was in this. So she was very, very insecure. I think that it was almost like she enjoyed praise kink because she was so negative for herself, which I think, yes, is part of praise kink. But the way that she constantly obsessed about, he's older, I'm not that attractive, he's way more professional than me, like all of the things that she obsessed in the negative self-talk was just exhausting to read. And then the thing that sent me over the edge was he sends her on a date with her son after knowing, being told and being shown that she at the very least is uncomfortable with her son. At the very most, he was verbally abusive to her. And so he sort of like manipulates her into going on a date with him. And sure, she didn't have to go on the date, but the fact that he valued his son's happiness over hers so much in a way that his son was abusive or just made her uncomfortable, just didn't, like, I just hated it. Any Rogue Will Do, I do not remember at all. The Exorcist, I was just horrible. Like, the movie is way better. The writing is really inaccessible. What Are the Odds? I had an early hookup. It is a brother's best friend or an ex-husband's best friend. They were together like 30% of the way, which again is another issue that I have. Enslaved was terrible. Terrible. She gets transported back and she ends up being a slave, and it's just gross. All Things Burn, I don't really remember this. I remember it being a hit man with his client, and I don't remember much else. We have The Violence, which I didn't think was a horror. Like, I can see why it was a horror, but I didn't really think it was. Like, it's a horror in the most basic sense of the word, that like the things that the characters are experiencing are horrifying in abuse and things like that, but it just didn't feel very horror to me. It felt like an Emily St. John Mandel book-esque. So Hide, I got like 14 pages in and it was unreadable. Sin With Me, in the very beginning, the hero basically says like, I would have been okay raping multiple women, which, yeah, that was enough for me. The Spanish Love Deception was another very exhausting read. There is so much introspection on the heroine's part, and there was no dialogue between the couple. I read about 40 pages, and what I said in my review, one piece of dialogue for 10 paragraphs of introspection was like not an exaggeration. It's genuinely like that. And the heroine, and both of them were pretty immature, and it was just exhausting. Sabotage is a stepbrother, and he uses a wine bottle to you know what I'm getting at, and I feel like I don't need to explain. We have Once a Laird, which I don't remember. We have Step Bully. I tried to avoid romances written by women. This was a step-brother romance, and it was entirely sex, which, see aforementioned comment about sex-centered stories. We have City of Gods and Monsters, which it was an urban fantasy series or a story about a girl whose best friend gets kidnapped when she was supposed to be the one that gets kidnapped. So she works with like these half devil aura seers or some shit like that. They're like bounty hunters. It was really hard to read. Like, nothing was happening. It's a really, really long book. I don't mind nothing happening if you're really focusing on your characters and your world, but there was nothing. Like, there was nothing. There was a bunch of meaningless scenes strung together, and I wasn't even rooting for the romance. We have Dark Desires, which was a pretty short, it was categorized as horror, but I wouldn't really consider it horror romance, but it is like a romance set in the 1800s with a woman who goes and works with a guy who works with dead bodies and like investigates them, and he hires her originally as a maid and then has her draw the bodies for him because she can draw really well. And it's a pretty short book, but I still had to DNF it because it was boring. We have Garden of Earthly Bodies, which is a book that was recommended to me because I listened to Tender is the Flesh. This one, nothing happened. It also was like incredibly triggering to me. I had just gotten out of the hospital and there was a lot of talk about blood diseases and things, and So then I DNF'd The Wall of Winnipeg and Me. This is the first Mariana Zapata I tried to read. I got 20% in, and again, this is another case of the heroine being like exhausting to read from. She was incredibly critical of herself, and the conflict or the plot of the story was really drawn out. The idea is that they get fake married so that he can get a visa, and it was at the 20% mark, they were still arguing about getting married or not. I DNF'd The Dragon Republic, which is the second book in the Poppy War series. Again, this is probably one that I'm going to return to, but I felt like any character development that we had with Ren from the first one was completely lost in the beginning of this one. She was making decisions that didn't really make a lot of sense to me, and her attitude and her like personality just felt odd to me, but I'll probably return to it at a later date, maybe. We have Terms and Conditions. I just found this really boring. Like, there's been a lot of discussion recently about The Hating Game and how like really mid that book is, and that's how I felt about this. Like, I find The Hating Game to be mid. I like the movie, but the book itself, I think I gave it 4 stars when I read it, but I remember absolutely nothing about it, except the wall matching the color of her eyes. But I think that book is mid, and this is even more mid than that. So, all right, Always Been You by QB Tyler. This is another author that I have issues with about her stories being really sex-centered. She focuses on really taboo topics, things that I think would be great for really emotional like exploration, and she doesn't do any of that. One of her books was on my most disappointing reads of the year, and this one I had to DNF because they had an early hookup, the relationship was just not there. We have Burn For Me, which is by the same author as Praise, so I probably won't read any more by her. I might read the second book in the Salacious Players, but I've heard it's very sex heavy, so you know. This is a student teacher. He's getting revenge on her for putting his father in prison, and they have a tumultuous relationship. It was the most toothless enemies to lovers I've ever read, and I don't think I need to expound upon that. We then have some fantasy romance that I was trying to read and just weren't really my thing. Like, I would pick them up and I just wouldn't really enjoy them. I don't remember much about them. I might possibly go back to them at one point, but I think the main reason that I DNF'd it was because it was just not good. So, we have God of Malice by Rena Kent. Again, this is another really long story. I think it's like 600 pages. I don't really jive with Rena Kent's writing. I find her writing to be very simple, and this being so long just didn't work. It was like everything was drawn out, all of the scenes were recycled, and it just didn't make sense. I DNF'd Babel. I have a video on Babel. My main issue with Babel was the characters to me were not, they didn't feel like fleshed out characters. I loved the conversations that we were having, but I felt like R.F. Kuang was very ham-fisted in the things that she was trying to get across, and I think that because I wasn't interested in the school setting and the plot was pretty slow and meandering, I needed the characters to be a little more, like, pick up a little more. I needed it to be a deeper character study than it was. Then we have After We Fell. This is the third book in the After series. Again, I have another video on this series by itself, And mostly, again, this was another really exhausting story to read, constantly fighting about the same things, and it's really overly long. Again, if you have a sort of like really over dramatic, over like soap opera-y story, it needs to be short. And this story was never satisfying. It was never wrapped up at the end of a book. There was always something going on. It never felt like we resolved any of the issues between the couple. It's not like we had new issues every book. It was always the same fights over and over again. We then had The Future of Humanity. This was just a little more like simple and also like sci-fi-y than I was looking for in the story. It referenced a lot of like science fiction ideas, and that's not really what I wanted. And then lastly, The Business of Blood. I was really excited for this. It's by Kerrigan Byrne, and it is a like very much like Stalking Jack the Ripper-esque story about a woman who is she cleans up crime scenes after the police and everybody has come through. And she worked on the Jack the Ripper case because one of her friends was killed. The writing here was very, very confusing. It didn't feel like Kerrigan Byrne. It also didn't feel like it was very comprehensive. I just don't think it was edited the best. I don't think it could have done another round of editing because some things just didn't really make sense. Some of the paragraphs felt like they were spliced in areas that they weren't supposed to be, and it was like hard for me to get into the story. So very disappointed on that one. So those were all of the things that I DNF'd in last year. I think in total I DNF'd about 40 books. I am a heavy enjoyer of DNFing. I am very all for DNFing. If you are not enjoying a book, stop reading it. DNF for your soul, DNF for clear skin, and no depression. That is going to be it for this video. Let me know down below if I should re-pick up one of these books, if I should give it a shot. If you are familiar with my reading taste, let me know. Let me know if maybe I was being too harsh on something. I have a lot of issues with sex-centered stories only. I enjoy sex in my stories. I find I need the sex scenes, but if the story is the growth of the characters in the relationship is solely focused on sex, then it's not really my thing. And I have a lot of issues with heroines that have a lot of negative self-talk. I don't mind it because negative self-talk is my default, but reading it in a character while also having it up here all the time is really exhausting. And I want a heroine that recognizes her value, or just doesn't constantly berate herself. So that's that. If you don't have any recommendations or you don't have anything that you're you need to pick that up again, leave a crying emoji for all of the really disappointing DNFs that I had this year. I have a goal to meet of 30% of the reads I read in 2023 being 5 stars. So only 5 stars for me, only 5 stars for you. If you are looking for more content from me, please don't forget to subscribe. You can also check out my Instagram and my podcast Instagram. You can also check out my podcast on all your favorite streaming platforms. It is a horror podcast. It's a lot of fun. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in my next one.